if we lack that kind of absolute proof, and maybe we should be grateful because it would be terrifying to see that kind of, divine intervention in the world for every generation in every place to see. We are left to establish a case without that absolute proof, often dealing more in probabilities. So what are some ways we can leverage history, philosophy, and science to do that? Depending on who you are and what you're talking about, the standard of proof can actually change dramatically. You can cross a busy street with cars going 70 miles an hour confidently because you take for granted that your sense perception is reliable and they're informing you about what's going on around you. You can eat a pork chop in a restaurant without fear of death because you're assuming that they cook it to 140. And you can sentence someone to life in prison in the court of law with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In history, there really isn't definitive proof. It's more looking at all the available information and taking your best guess as to what happened. And if more information is dug up, then maybe the best guess has to change. Now, the field of philosophy can attempt to make absolute truth claims if they think they can rule out all logical alternate possibilities. And if they don't think they can do that, then maybe they can construct an argument with different statements that can be, tested to be true that leads to a conclusion. Now, philosophy has some limitations that it has to be logically sound, and just because an argument is logically sound does not mean it's true. And there's also the person evaluating the argument. So even if someone cannot refute the logic or cannot refute some of the claims that go into developing the conclusion, they still don't feel obligated to believe it. Maybe it's a rhetorical trick.
It's a trap!
Maybe it has more to do with use of language than proof. Because proof has a volitional aspect as well. A person can choose not to believe something even if a very solid case is presented. In the domain of science, it's largely testing ideas or gathering information to support or refute an idea. So a testable hypothesis is proposed, and then an experiment is carried out to test that hypothesis. Now, in terms of limitations, maybe one of the more obvious ones is that it's kind of limited to things you can test. If it's not something you can test using an experiment and you move from that to something that you're testing with your thoughts, you have departed from science into philosophy. And I think a lot of times in books that I have read, that transition happens and the scientist will continue to call it science. And that is, a major problem. Also, I'm not sure if it's even possible to test something in the domain of the supernatural with the scientific method that was, intended for study of the natural world. It's not meant to test ideas that cannot be falsified in a lab or falsified with data. That's not how science works. Okay, so what about personal testimony? What are the standards of proof there? Well, again, it normally comes down to if the person has a reason to lie, how well you know the person, and what they're talking about. If it's someone you trust deeply, but they're talking about how they saw Bigfoot in the woods, you'd be more skeptical of that than if they were just talking about traffic that day. And a major limitation of personal testimony is everyone has a crazy uncle. There are so many people out there who are perfectly willing to believe and talk about total nonsense that we can now listen to coast-to-coast radio for like 4 hours straight and never give anything they talk about a serious thought after we turn it off. Now, what about religion? What is generally accepted as religious proof for people who assume there is a God? Well, religions generally appeal to the experiential, what people personally experience as verification. They appeal to tradition, and they appeal to claims of demonstrations of miraculous power. Now, I'm not saying that tongue-in-cheek. If you're a group that does believe in God, or a God of some kind, and you have established a religious tradition around that concept of the God you believe in, then getting a supernatural stamp of approval through some kind of demonstration of power or a miraculous sign is actually pretty important, especially if you have neighboring groups who claim to have different concepts of God. You want to be the group that's, validated in that way. And I would suggest that religions that appeal to, sacred writings are also appealing to the miraculous because they believe those writings have supernatural origins. Now, what are the major limitations here? I think the obvious one is that if these miraculous signs are not occurring with every generation, then the standard of evidence gets lower as time goes on. Okay, so that said, if there is something that could approach an absolute truth claim for a religion, what would that look like? I'd suggest it could look like a miracle occurring in a context where a miracle is predicted or expected. It's not just out of the blue, and it lacks natural explanations for the event. You can't explain it without acknowledging the supernatural in some way. And there are multiple reliable witnesses there, so they can confirm with one another that they're not hallucinating. So an immediate example would be Elijah on Mount Carmel, where the purpose of them being there is to figure out whose God is real. And you have this crowd of people around, and fire comes down from the sky and consumes the sacrifice on the altar. Now, another probably more obvious one would be the resurrection. You have this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, who claims to have new teaching about God. And when the religious authorities challenged him on what sign will you provide to verify that this teaching is valid, where does your authority come from? He told them that the sign he would provide was rising from the dead. This was a predicted miracle in a heavily theological context, a context where, a miracle kind of is at home. So if you were there, you heard Jesus claiming to be God, you heard him saying that he would provide a sign to verify his claims. You saw that the Romans very thoroughly made sure he was dead. You knew he was buried, and then you saw him up walking around, talking to people, not just to individuals, but to groups. Then that would very closely approach absolute proof. Now, note we're very careful. That would be absolute proof for the people who were there. And as you get farther and farther from the event, then you have to depend more and more on other supporting evidence because the standard of evidence is going down over time. You have to depend on things like historical reliability and the reliability of the witnesses, and did they have any motive to lie. You have to take some of these other things into account as a modern person. So if we lack that kind of absolute proof, and maybe we should be grateful because it would be terrifying to see that kind of, divine intervention in the world for every generation in every place to see. We are left to establish a case without that absolute proof, often dealing more in probabilities. So what are some ways people go about doing this, leveraging things like personal testimony, history, philosophy, and science to build their case of probability? I include personal testimony because it's not always individual testimony. If there are tens of thousands or hundreds of millions of people all claiming similar experiences, whether that's UFO sightings or, miraculous healings, then that can be a significant data point for someone to evaluate through an academic lens. And that is something that Craig Keener is fairly well known for. Now, when it comes to individual personal experience and using that as proof, I'm not saying that it's invalid to take an experience that you cannot explain in any other way and attribute that as evidence. But I hope you would concede that there are people who disagree with you, who have wildly different beliefs about religion and other things than you, who would also use their personal experiences as solid evidence and would consider them to be solid evidence for everyone else. So it's helpful to go into other domains to find evidence from different places like history, philosophy, or science to back up these, internal senses of what's true. So how would one employ methods from historians to test religious ideas? Well, a lot of specific religious truth claims are based on events that occur within history. And if something is especially well documented, then historians can draw some kind of conclusions even if they're not certain. So what's an example? It's an extremely well-established historic fact, to the extent that historic facts can be established, that Jesus died. You do not have to believe that Jesus is God to believe that he died due to the historic evidence. So secular and religious and even people who are hostile to Christianity can at least acknowledge that much. He was a real person, he was killed. How does that impact anything? For one, it follows the Christian narrative, and it flies in the face of the Islamic narrative, where if you're a Muslim, you probably don't believe that Jesus died. You believe he was a prophet who was taken up into heaven without dying. And there's different Islamic theories behind that, but you can see where the weight of history has something to say here. Kind of a variant to this historical approach is to try to demonstrate that a miraculous claim in the past was reliably documented at the time, that those historic records were not tampered with from the time they were reliably documented to the present day, and that considering the evidence, there is not an alternate explanation other than what the documents claim to have happened. That's the approach taken by Mike Licona and Gary Habermas in their book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And they try very hard to stick with what they call the minimum facts approach, where they are only using historical evidence if that evidence is attested by both secular and religious scholars. Kind of regardless of their background, they think this is something that's true. So philosophy, what are some ways that philosophy can be employed? Some will actually take a purely philosophical approach without leveraging much history or science. And that, is fairly easy to dismiss as verbal trickery, but can be interesting to think about. R.C. Sproul, I think, took this route in his book, Defending Your Faith. Now, philosophical arguments that have scientific and historical evidence supporting their premises is a more robust approach. The premises are the statements of the argument that lead to a conclusion, that build a logical case. Now, the power of this is, even if it doesn't provide definitive proof for a specific religious claim, they can at least be used to test whether the position is reasonable. Like if the premises are reasonable and they logically produce this conclusion, then the conclusion is reasonable. These types of philosophical arguments also hold up very well over long periods of time, because they are based on rules of logic, not on a particular culture's understanding of science, which, changes. So a famous example would be Dr. William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. Versions of that argument have been used for over 1,000 years. It goes something like this. Premise 1 is whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2 is the universe began to exist. So the conclusion from those premises, if they are sound, is the universe has a cause. Note premise 2 because I think is a great illustration about how this sort of argument interacts with science. It says the universe began to exist. Now, does science agree or disagree with that? That depends, right? In the ancient world, science agreed with that. Then this idea developed that the universe was eternal. And then the idea that the universe was eternal was thrown out because of discoveries in cosmology. And now people are considering the possibility of an eternal multiverse. So science has a changing relationship with this statement that the universe had a beginning. But this statement, as far as I'm aware, has stayed the same over the centuries for the sake of this argument. Also note that an argument can be logically sound whether or not it's true. I mean, logically, the conclusion follows from those two premises. But if one of the premises is wrong or proven false, then the argument doesn't work even though it's logically sound. So what about science? What contributions can science make in our evaluation of religious ideas? Well, a lot. A lot. So a big one is that science can generate new evidence and new data by studying the natural world. And that evidence and data can have implications into theology and religious beliefs. I think that's self-evident when we think about, the God of Thunder, the classic, God of the Gaps examples. Now, our understanding of the world based on what science has to say is subject to change, but that doesn't mean science has nothing to say. Likewise, even if it's not possible for science to verify a supernatural cause using the scientific method, science can still make probability assessments of the natural alternatives to that supernatural cause, if that makes sense. I think you see this a lot with the anthropic principle when you're talking about evolution, or when you're talking about what's considered the teleological argument for design in the universe. What are the probability that things would end up this way by chance? That is something that science can speak to. Now, scientific philosophy can also be leveraged in treating our religious beliefs like a hypothesis and trying to make those beliefs accountable to the available evidence to reach a conclusion. You could actually try to build a case for both sides of the argument and actually commit yourself to maybe first of all gathering evidence for your position and trying to prove it true, and then take and dedicate some amount of time to gathering evidence for the opposition and trying to make the strongest case possible against what you believe, and see how those cases compare when you're finished. What are things that these worldview positions have a difficult time accounting for? Which one of these has the most alignment with reality? What are the major strengths and weaknesses on each side? I think that kind of intellectual detachment and trying to represent the other side in the best light possible can also lead to a lot of fresh insights. It's kind of good to remember that people who disagree with you do have reasons for what they believe, whether they're Christians or atheists. Okay, so we talked about types of evidence, their limitations, and how some of these kinds of evidence have been applied for testing religious worldviews. So what's the point of all of this? Is there one type of evidence that's any better than the other? Well, I think plainly, if some kind of theistic or pantheistic worldview were true, then a direct communication from a particular God just laying it all out, telling humans what's up, that would probably take the cake. Like, how do you overcome that? No matter what your starting assumptions are, if you are legitimately being told what's going on by God, then some of those assumptions will probably have to go, whatever that guy says, that's what's up. Now, the problem with this is every God-worshipping religion in the world recognizes that that is the primo evidence to back up their belief system. So you have all kinds of people claiming a supernatural stamp of approval for wildly different things, and it's just a confusing web of differing beliefs. Now, just because there's this confusing mess of different belief systems, those are still candidate worldviews that could potentially be true. So if in one of those worldviews a person did receive legitimate direct communication from their God, could you fault them for finding that compelling? I mean, if it truly is what they think it is, it should be. Now, for all the people out there who don't believe in a God or don't claim to have a direct revelation from the creator of the universe about how the world works, where did those people go to test their ideas, to evaluate whether their worldview is accurate? Well, anywhere. Why? Because if a person's worldview is true and coherent, then any domain of truth is going to support that unified complementary picture. And some great places to start are philosophy, science, and history, because those are well-established ways of studying the world from different angles that have methodology built into them for discerning truth and examining evidence. Where there is inevitably conflict between two pieces of evidence, whether it is within the same domain, like two scientists who have findings that seem to disagree with one another, or whether it's across domains where perhaps assumptions that were brought forth from a religious text are challenged by new discovery in archaeology, then the natural thing is not to immediately discard a worldview before at least looking at the quality and reliability of the evidence. But we have to be pretty careful that we don't paint ourselves into a corner here, where we get in such a position that the evidence must first match our assumptions about the world before it can be considered. Because then we're in a place where the evidence and the reality of the world around us, in fact, is not what's determining our worldview, but our worldview is determining which evidence is acceptable and which evidence is valid enough to be interpreted. And it's kind of easy to fall into that, right? We have our psychological schema that we want to make everything fit into. And that's where it becomes valuable to speak with people who disagree with us about things, people who bring other perspectives, and who see evidence as valid that we might not, and can help us understand the world in a more complete way, because they can essentially unlock these things for us that we had, a priori excluded. If you have watched this far through the video, consider me surprised. I will be attempting to make videos on what I see as difficult worldview level topics that I do not claim to fully understand. If you enjoy that type of dialogue, if you would value being able to converse over that sort of thing, feel free to subscribe and tag along as we kind of engage in the conversation. But let me hear your thoughts in the comments section, and where I butchered this, or maybe some things that you thought made sense. Other than that, thanks for watching and have a great day.